Oh, there we go.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alejandra Gaviria Serna, and my co-organizer that I am here with today is David Eng. We are both PhD students at the Social Justice Institute at UBC, and we are delighted to be welcoming to our fourth and final panel of this 2022 Art Memory Justice Symposium, Resilient Cartographies, Everyday Strategies of Social Justice that reemerged during pandemic times. Before we begin, we want to acknowledge that David and I are virtually hosting this panel from the unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, a core part of our work as a social justice scholars and the foundation of this symposium centers around decolonization. And with this land acknowledgement and affirmation that decolonization includes, but is not limited to return of the stolen land, restitution, reparations, and justice for past and ongoing colonial subjugations. As students who work, live, and benefit from unceded territories, it is necessary for us to start our conversation recognizing and working in solidarity with ongoing indigenous struggles for sovereignty. Hello, David.
Hi, Alejandra. So the title of our fourth and final theme today in our symposium is Reflections, Praxis, and Explorations of Community Struggles and Resilience During Pandemic Times. The impact of the pandemic and the subsequent imposition of isolation and individualization was strongly felt at educational institutions in particular. We saw this with the quick and almost automatic transition of all aspects of university life, meetings, classes, and even socializing to Zoom and other online platforms. We also saw how many institutions essentially abandoned students, many whom were removed from their home communities, and left them to navigate the early stages of the pandemic on their own. In this panel, we reflect on the challenges the pandemic imposed on student communities and the impacts it has had on collective knowledge building and for student-driven collaborative action-based initiatives. In addition, we will hear about student community building, solidarity, and care within the university community in COVID times, despite the often felt neglect from the institution to care for students during the pandemic. Okay, so this presentation is dear to Alejandra and I's heart because as students, this is part of actually the genesis of this symposium. So we're really excited to introduce our moderators. Eylul Kara is a second-year international scholar at the Faculty of Arts majoring in international relations with a minor in history. Her research interests include politics of humanitarianism and women's peace and security, as she is looking to specialize in law and transitional justice after her undergraduate degree. She has worked with grassroots women's organizations in Thailand, Turkey, India, and Canada, working towards fighting forced marriage and young women's right to education. She is the co-founder of Building Bridges, a new initiative of Indigenous and non-Indigenous youth working towards bridging the knowledge gap in Indigenous history through education to encourage non-Indigenous youth to take action through social entrepreneurship. Anoushka Chandarana is a graduate student at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at the University of British Columbia, Vancouver. Originally from India, she combines her background in sociology with her experience as a woman of color to advance issues of social justice. She has worked in the Indian education sector, trying to improve the quality of education offered by public schools in her city. Here in Vancouver, Anoushka is currently working with the International Organization for Migration to develop a diaspora engagement strategy for the Mongolian diaspora. She has a keen interest in understanding the role of gender in protests and hopes to push for gender equality as the world copes with the pandemic and the current refugee crisis. Now, on to our panelists. Megan Bobetsis, she, her, is a MA student in gender, sexuality, and women's studies at Simon Fraser University and previously received a BA from SFU and a journalism degree from Langara College. Megan worked for 3 years as a project coordinator at the Center for Gender and Sexual Health Equity prior to starting her MA. Her research interests include intimate partner violence, sexual assault, BC criminal justice system, and sexual assault, IPV, and survivor resilience. And last but not least, Cheryl-Lee Madden is an interdisciplinary community demographer whose advocacy ensures your community group's opinions, ideas, and points of view are not only heard and understood, but have civic level impact, especially amidst competing voices and opinions. She is passionate about how women were disproportionately affected, with the retail food services having experienced a greater degree of job loss, many of which will not return post-pandemic. To this end, she advocates for labor force gender equality and believes spatial mismatch hypothesis that will shed a light on who is returning to the downtown central business district and how we can create critical social infrastructure to ensure women are not being permanently left behind. Community partnership building involves creating healing, post-colonial space-time reclamation in collaboration with the Black community in cartographic Afrofuturism visualization, for example, listening to Indigenous people, people of color, the elderly, newcomers, refugees, and other diverse groups by filing reports that voice their concerns within City Hall, where it matters most. Welcome to our moderator and panelists.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. I'm Eylul, and I'll be one of the moderators. So I'd like to first of all say a huge welcome to our panelists. We're really looking forward to your presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Eylul. I'm Anoushka, and I'd also like to thank the organization team for having us here today. And yeah, Eylul, go for it.
Thank you, Anoushka. As already mentioned, we have two amazing panelists today. Megan will be sharing her incredible work, Healing and Justice for Sexual Violence Survivors, Communities of Care During a Global Pandemic. It is important to recognize that we're living in a time when sexual violence remains a prominent issue in society. Yet, the voices of survivors are still silenced. The isolation that comes with being a survivor of sexual violence is only exacerbated by the pandemic. This project aims to create a community of care for survivors and highlights what it means to be a survivor. Undertaken as a part of Sexual Assault Awareness Month, the project asks survivors of sexual violence, what does healing and/or justice mean to you? And asks the community, how do you support survivors and/or what would you say in support of survivors?
Cheryl, on the other hand, is working on really relevant things, and her project is titled "Mapping of Uncharted COVID-19 Evictions: Are Women Disproportionately Affected by Job Losses?" Before she goes into the details, I'll just quickly give an overview of her project. Among global cities, Vancouver's spatial mismatch is unique. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the social stressors of living and working in Vancouver were further compounded due to the pandemic-related job losses. Moreover, few affordable rental units remained available to renters. To date, there has been scant research into the long-term social effects of women's job and income losses vis-a-vis their mobility. So Cheryl looks at a small subset of the retail sector, Vancouver's working poor women, and explores in real time income eviction data to demonstrate that these women were disproportionately affected by COVID-19 job losses. I'd now like to invite Megan to tell us more about her work.
Yeah, thank you so much to both of you for the introduction and for having me here today. I'm really excited for our conversation and also for learning more about Cheryl-Lee's work. So yeah, I think I'm ready to, I was going to ask, is there a way for me to put the link to my project in the chat? Or if maybe one of you could help me do that?
Yeah, I think David and Alejandra will do that. Just give them a second.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then I can share my slides now if that's ready. Great. Sorry, let me just get set up here. Okay, yeah. Thank you so much again for the introduction. My name is Megan. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm currently a master's student in the Department of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at Simon Fraser University. And I'm joining today from the unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, colonially known as Vancouver, Canada. And as my project deals with sexual violence, as you know from the introduction and from the title, I think it's also important to note that in doing a land acknowledgement, we're not just talking about the violence of stolen land, but also the violence disproportionately experienced by Indigenous women and gender diverse people as a result of colonization and racism. And so this takes me into content note for this presentation and also for my project. This project focuses on sexual violence, but from a healing and justice lens. This project also refers to those who have experienced sexual violence as survivors, although I know that this term doesn't resonate with everyone. And my presentation doesn't include any depictions of sexual violence, although I do have a general definition of sexual violence on one slide, and we'll discuss some of the themes that came out of the project. Okay, so as I mentioned before, I'm a master's student, and this project that I'm presenting on is one of the final projects I'm doing as part of my program. But the project actually came out of my involvement on the advisory committee for Sexual Assault Awareness Month at SFU earlier this year. And so the aim of Sexual Assault Awareness Month, or SAM, is to raise awareness about education and prevention of sexual violence, and also to create a community where we can better support survivors. And so Sexual Assault Awareness Month is usually recognized by organizations and governments in April or May, but at some universities in Vancouver, including SFU and UBC, we recognize it in January to kind of better align with the student schedule. So every year there's a specific theme to SAM at SFU, and this year it was cultivating a community of care. So meaning fostering a community that recognizes the unique journeys of survivors and empowers people to better support survivors. And many of these aspects are rooted in Indigenous practices of fostering community. And I have a screenshot on this slide of some of the specific goals of SAM. And I also put the definition of sexual violence on this slide, as I didn't want to assume that this is something we all might be familiar with. So my project is very closely tied to the theme of SAM this year, because the broad goal was to highlight what healing or justice means to survivors of sexual violence, and also how the community supports survivors. So to do this, we created a project webpage that asked survivors of sexual violence, what does healing and or justice look like to you? And asked the community, how do you support survivors, and or what would you say in support of survivors? And so responses could be submitted directly and anonymously right on the webpage. And we accepted short or long form written answers, poetry, visual uploads. It was, we left it pretty open for interpretation. We started sharing about the project and asking for submissions in late December of last year, and then all through Sexual Assault Awareness Month in January. And we ended up receiving over 20 submissions from survivors and community members. And then hopefully the link is in the chat there. Yeah, so feel free, like I invite everybody to take a look at the project webpage, because we also now have all of the submissions shared on that webpage. So feel free to look through those as I kind of go on through this presentation and talk about the overall goals of the project and then what came out of the responses. So my intention with this project was to have a survivor-centered narrative in the way that the project focuses on what healing and justice means to survivors from their own experiences and in their own words, so that we can recognize the unique and complex paths that survivors navigate, but also recognize their strength and resilience in doing so. I think so often when sexual violence is discussed, it's from an outside perspective and not necessarily informed by lived experiences. And I think this is partly because of the stigma that still surrounds sexual violence, but also because space isn't always made for survivors to share safely. And so, because of this, it was important for me to create a space that allowed survivors to share anonymously and in any format that felt right to them. And I also wanted this project to highlight the various experiences of healing or justice and how there's no one survivor story and there's no one way to kind of move forward or move on after experiencing violence. I think discourse around sexual violence often focuses on prevention and accountability for offenders, both of which are important aspects, but I wanted this project to shed light on the way survivors go on with their lives after the fact. And in the same way that I wanted to highlight how there's no one survivor story, there's no one experience of healing or justice, I also wanted to show that there's no one way to offer support to survivors, and every survivor needs support in different ways. Support looks different to every survivor. And so the community aspect is meant to show the various ways that the community is already supporting survivors, and also kind of create like a small archive of messages of support for survivors that will stay online in this place indefinitely. So the actual online webpage is meant to create an online community of care for survivors that not only has these messages of support, but also allows survivors to see their own voices and the voices of other survivors recognized there. So as I mentioned before, we received over 20 submissions to the project, and they took short and long form written answers, as well as some poetry. I'm not going to share any of the submissions directly in this presentation, as we decided to have them only be featured on the webpage. I invite you to take a look at the link in the chat as I talk through some of the overall themes that we saw across responses. So when looking at the responses from survivors, there was this theme of gentleness or being gentle with yourself, whether this means meeting yourself where you're at each day with no expectations or judgment, learning how to deal with triggers, or just being gentle with your physical body. And many of the responses from survivors also touched on recognition in the way that having opportunities to share safely is important, whether this is with someone that the survivor is close with and they trust, or through projects like this one. And some of the responses also addressed recognition of survivors' experiences within institutions and policies. So meaning education and justice systems that are survivor-centered and actually accountable to survivors. And then when we look at the community responses, I think the most prominent theme was just about listening to survivors. So hearing and acknowledging their stories, and first and foremost, believing survivors when they come forward. And in line with listening, there was also this theme of creating awareness and education around sexual violence. So many responses mentioned the importance of cultivating a community where survivors can come forward and the community can have the awareness and be educated in a way that they can meet survivors with support. So throughout all the responses from community and from survivors, it was clear that fostering a sense of community and care is important. And I think that this theme of community is especially important because experiencing sexual violence can be a very isolating experience. And I think this is even further exacerbated by the pandemic that we've all been living through, in the ways that, social isolation, when we have more time alone, can sometimes mean returning to old memories or trauma resurfacing. And then physical isolation could mean not being able to seek the services or support that you did prior to the pandemic. So yeah, I really hope that this project created an online space that gave survivors an outlet to share and also to receive support. And of course, we hope that sharing all these responses will help guide the community and service providers as to what is needed to continue to support survivors and create this community of care. So yeah, thank you so much for having me here today and allowing me to share my project. I put my email on this slide just in case anyone wants to reach out or has any questions about the project. Feel free to email me. And yeah, thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Megan. That was amazing. Let's now hear from Cheryl-Lee.
Thank you, everyone. I'm just going to put in the general comments. I don't think I can add. Can I add my website to the general comments? I don't think I can do anything.
Yes, we will add it shortly.
In comments. Okay. So could you please put up my slides? Thanks. So, okay, and let me go into full screen then. So I don't seem to be able to move through my slides. Maybe I'll just go into my slide. And here I am here. Can you see my slides now? Am I moving through?
Yeah, we can see it now.
Okay, so you're on to the next page, the second page.
Yep.
Okay, so my name's Cheryl-Lee Madden, and I'm a student of the University of British Columbia. I'm in sociology and taking community studies right at the moment. And so I'm looking at how to create gender equality for women, especially that were affected during COVID job loss. So it comes down to items like issues of security and power. And so it's a long journey, but we do get there through leadership and collective responsibility. So I looked at, from my own experiences as a student during lockdown, I mean, all students work while they go to university, most of them do. So I had been in retail services, which I have now left, but not everybody, like say an immigrant, has the ability to just move into higher, more secure level of employment. But I noticed drastic changes during COVID. You'll see that the red dots are female-led households. They're single women looking after families. They may be existing on social services, and these are the retail food opportunities. So they could maybe live and work in Hastings Sunrise, but there's less single parent households in the West End and the downtown, for example. So in March 2020, retail food service became essential overnight. We're all talking about gender and all of the complex issues around gender, and we need to start thinking about the people who serve us and how they manage to live in this overpriced city, and why women are still underpaid after all these decades of fighting for equality. So as I said, they're regarding questions of power and safety, and women in precarious essential frontline food retail service jobs were impacted instantaneously overnight. And it's a gendered workspace. So what does gender inequality look like? The UBC student group Capacity brainstormed and made this picture here that you see, sketching sustainable cities in March 2022. And in the middle, you'll see how can we ensure everyone will be part of the dialogue and decision-making process. So that's the emphasis of my talk today. How can we raise awareness of gender inequality and create equality for women? So the retail food service workers, mainly women, were working in low-wage, precarious jobs. They became essential overnight. They were the first to be unemployed under lockdown measures. So an example of gender norms in Canada, women, this is gendered work and gendered care. They're the primary caregivers of both children and the elderly in home. We assume women will be the main caregivers, not because of their sex, but because we see caregiving as part of their role as a female parent and a culturally constructed association between femininity and nurturing. The uneven burden of caregiving in Canada has economic and health outcome repercussions for women, including contributing to the gender wage gap. And policies that overlook the role of men as primary caregivers and nurturers, that just perpetuates gender stereotypes that are harmful to men as well as women. Gender influences. The majority of paid and unpaid childcare in Canada is performed by women. Males, especially between 17 and 18, suffer more injury from work, and that's a gendered influence. And a large proportion of women are are in university STEM degrees, but the majority are still men. So what does gender equality look like? These 3 sentences can sum it up. Gender equality, all genders have equal conditions for realizing their full human rights. They are equal participants in the home, their community, and their society. Different groups of women may experience the same situation differently, such as access to services and employment. So women in Canada who work full-time on average only earn 87 cents to every dollar earned by men. Women also they're more often victims of domestic and sexual violence. Women also continue to be underrepresented in leadership and executive positions. And the gap is even larger for women with particular intersecting identifying factors, such as trans women and women with disability. Inequalities have been heightened and exacerbated during COVID. So how does women's caregiving work intersect with the need to cope, resist, protest, and confront? The downtown retail food outlet shopping malls and cafes, they existed pre-COVID on very small profit margins. Now many of them may be closed forever and not returning. So the downtown business core has drastically changed, and we need to map it out to see who will be returning and where these women have gone pre-COVID that lost their jobs. So women were permanently left behind by COVID job loss. The everyday care acts that can be made visible through the arts of practice are to demand socially responsible, affordable housing strategies, especially for those fleeing global conflict who seek Canada as a new home, for example, Ukraine. How may we take low-paying frontline retail food service jobs to support the family? Those people coming over, they may not have access to jobs. The first job that is available may be a food retail service job. So the ways in which labor, office jobs, both structurally and historically, have changed. Workers like myself, I now work from home. I don't work while I go to school as a retail worker. I work for Statistics Canada. I work remotely from my home for the Edmonton office. Not everybody has access to that. Post-pandemic, the downtown office core looks much different than once those workers have left. Collective strategies of care, we could create crowdsourced GIS maps to map out commute times to work. And that's regarding the spatial mismatch, which I'll explain more. And we can give voice for those returning to the downtown core. And we can create a policy brief recommendations on affordable housing strategies for Vancouver City Hall social planners. So examples of assumptions at work: women are the predominant gender in nursing and elementary school teaching. Portraying women as responsible for young children is a gender norm that has contributed to high numbers of women becoming elementary school teachers. So let's re-examine and design an implementation of an immigrant integration program not one size fits all. Let's focus on integrating refugees into the workforce and an approach for all refugees, regardless of gender, culture, or religion. Let's think of family immigrants to Canada as government-sponsored refugees. They might have had in their household the husband or father. They were the breadwinner. Now they come to Canada. He can't get the status as a doctor, for example, so he might be driving a taxi. The woman, the wife, is now no longer just a caregiver. She might have a job and be able to run a successful business. So dynamic shifts in families we have to look at. So what assumptions do we have about the roles of men and women in relation to their participation in the workforce? So the spatial mismatch is that under the premise that people with low wage jobs travel farther and have longer commute times to work, because it's basically you drive out of the city until you qualify for affordable housing, because it's too expensive to live in Vancouver, especially for, say, a retail worker with limited income. So what we have to do then is create more meaningful work within Vancouver and affordable housing. This is from the 2016 census. It'll be interesting to see with the 2021 census commute times and what people did. So people, as they drive out of Vancouver, the red zones, they have less access to transportation, meaning they have to buy cars to come back into the city once COVID restrictions have been lifted and these retail jobs open again. So in the first map that I showed you, where retail outlets existed and where maybe one parent households led by women live, and I suggested Hastings, East Hastings, you see that they may have good transportation there, but is there affordable housing in Vancouver? There might be better affordable housing in Port Kells, for example, where my cursor is. I don't know if you can see it, but there's absolutely no transportation out there. So they have longer commute times. So low amenity dense zones, residents must leave their neighborhoods just to meet basic needs. And amenities meaning, can you work and live in the same neighborhood? Can you go to your corner store, buy your groceries and work there and live? So consider the labor and affordable housing issue from another's perspective or position. What are the existing structures that protect or disadvantage marginalized communities? Tax regulations, for example, or access to public transit. What are the specific intersecting identity factors that make people vulnerable to existing frameworks like low-income single mothers, undocumented youth, trans person of color, rural Muslim? Who are the people most impacted by these frameworks? So that's my end of my slide now. I'm just going to go back to the first slide and leave it on that one, because that is the one where I created a map. I mean, we have to create a crowdsourced GIS map, but if we could find out where women work and actually live, this map here, it's going to look totally different post-COVID, but are they able to live and work in Vancouver? Thanks.
Thank you so much. And both of your works are absolutely amazing and so inspiring. And I just would like to comment, I love how you mentioned, both of you, that there isn't one way inequality or sexual assault is experienced. And it's so important to recognize the multidimensionality of narratives, which we can hear only as a community if we listen and listen to the voices who are silenced by our system. And I think it is crucial to stray away from our conventional understandings of how gendered violence and inequality is experienced by those who experience it. Yeah, so I'll just give it to Anoushka for her question.
Yeah, thank you so much for both your work. It was just fascinating to listen to, just like Eylul mentioned. Megan, I really appreciated what you said about creating a more survivor centered approach, and especially keeping in mind the layers of isolation that were felt during the pandemic. And Cheryl-Lee, your point on using data to understand and create programs that cater to those most impacted instead of using just like a one size fits all approach. But what I particularly liked was the ways in which both your pieces reflect on something that we've been discussing throughout the day: the importance of community and caring for those around us, as well as the importance of building accessibility in our day to day living. So, keeping that in mind, I guess the question was that the pandemic has obviously impacted our lives and our communities in very, very different ways. Considering that both of you have worked with different communities, how have you all come to understand resilience? Often we've seen the narrative around resilience being shaped as positive, but sometimes resilience is not a choice, but just a survival mechanism. Is this something that resonates with the work you all have done? And how do systemic barriers shape our reaction to social challenges? Sorry, that was quite a bit, but feel free to just take what you all want and respond to that.
Well, I have firsthand experience of being resilient. I never thought of the idea of being able to work from home, and I'm fortunate enough right now, and I'm always thinking of the person that sells me the cup of coffee. Do they have the same access as I'm privileged to have, being a University of British Columbia student, furthering my education? However, for my situation, Statistics Canada has found that it's been so successful, they're going to keep people working from home. So that was quite new, but it's been working so well. Here I'm in Vancouver and I'm working for Edmonton. However, I'm always thinking about those frontline retail workers who were the most impacted by COVID. Can they have the same sense of resiliency? And those are the people we have to reach out to. You know, look at Amazon. When people couldn't, social determinants of health, they couldn't afford to stay home if they were sick. So they brought COVID to the processing line, to the meat packing line. You know, we've got to look at everybody. It's a social, economic, it's housing, it's transportation. And do they have meaningful work?
Thank you so much, Cheryl-Lee. Megan, do you want to comment?
Yeah, definitely. That's a great question. And I like how you framed it as, not everybody has the choice in resilience. Sometimes we're put in positions where resilience is kind of imposed, I guess. But I think when we're thinking about resilience in the time of the pandemic and with this community of survivors of sexual violence that I'm talking about, I think to me, resilience is about resisting any one narrative, as we've kind of been talking about, and giving survivors the ability to talk about their experience in their own words in ways that are comfortable to them. And so I see it kind of as like paving these pathways of resilience from people's own voices and their own stories. And I think like because of the isolation that's been imposed from the pandemic, that's even more powerful when we listen to these stories or make spaces for these stories in a time of isolation. And so that was one of my hopes for this project was to resist the isolation that not only comes with sometimes being a survivor, but also during this time. And I think like when I'm just thinking more about resilience and this topic, like theories of sexual violence so often focus on power and control. And I think one way to show resilience and resistance to this is to reclaim the power of the narrative and the way that we talk about our stories or our lives going forward. That's what I'm thinking about.
Thank you so much. Yeah, Definitely agree. And I think it's really important to break through certain deterministic frameworks that have been so um, harshly built and which doesn't usually include the voices and the narratives that you have mentioned. So I just like to shift the gears a little bit and talk about more of a student experience and certain experiences you guys have had. I would love to hear about it. So just would like to ask you guys, as a student, what gestures or care work have you witnessed in your surroundings during the pandemic? In the context of solitary virtual education, how have students been organizing? How has this struggle engagement encountered the academic institution during COVID?
Well, what I noticed right away, I was in Urban Studies 400 and geography. Immediately, students created the WhatsApp group and Discord. So, we were virtually in touch and meeting up, even virtually. But immediately, like, students are really good on social media to connect. And then people that were feeling really isolated or alone, you know, we could kind of reach out so that um, they knew that they had caring people around them. So often when you're facing isolation, you insulate and you drop networks. So this way it's really important to still connect and still ask, how are you doing? And I'm here if you're ever wanting someone to talk to or a cup of coffee. You can still have a virtual coffee. How about you, Megan?
Yeah, I think I have a pretty similar experience to you. I started my master's program in this past September. So it was kind of like when things were sort of just like starting to go back to normal. I think that was like when SFU first started having classes back in person. So my first semester was all in person. I think that was really nice, but also like weird in the sense of people are getting used to like being back around other people, especially in an academic setting. But I think it was nice for my cohort to be able to meet face to face, and we're all incoming at the same time and kind of first off establish these in-person connections. And now in this semester, most of my classes are either online or doing a hybrid method. So I feel like I'm grateful that I was able to make these connections in person first that have kind of like carried on in online spaces now. And my department does sort of like, I think bi-weekly, like online Zoom, like check-in meetings just for us all to kind of like stay in touch, which I think is really nice. I mean, like Zoom fatigue is real. I definitely feel tired of like being on screen all the time, but I think that these are like really nice, yeah, gestures of care that I see around me that that matter for me as a student.
I also noticed the graduates, like the ones writing their PhD, for example, they had an online writing community. So they would take time once a week to check in and join and say, this is how my thesis work is going or my dissertation. And, um, you know, helpful things like, how do you task manage? How do you manage your time? How do you, because so much with the lockdown, they were finding they weren't getting the writer's spark. So they weren't able to write. So just hearing how they got together and now I'm doing hybrid classes. So we have with sociology, we have a Wednesday online discussion, but I don't find the online discussion as really helpful. I told my professor on Friday when we met face to face, I said this discussion was just so much more worthwhile because it's so different when, I don't know about you, Megan, but when you've got the one-on-one and you're feeding off each other and you can see them. Just the online board, I mean, somebody throws up a comment, but I don't know. We do have a hybrid right now, so there are challenges, but the getting together, it's good though, Megan, that you were able to at least start out, together.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, especially as students. I think I just related to everything that y'all were saying so well. But just leading to that, I have a sort of follow-up question. We've all experienced social isolation, and the one thing that has brought us together is the internet. But the internet still is a privilege for so many. And so, in the work that y'all were doing, did y'all see that maybe like keeping the pandemic restrictions that y'all couldn't meet? What were the challenges that y'all came across when y'all were trying to build relationships with the people y'all were working with? This could be either as a student or as in the work that y'all doing. How did y'all overcome them? Megan,
Yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
sure. Yeah. Another great question. And that's something that's like really been on my mind a lot in thinking through this project is like, yeah, thinking about accessibility and like how do I connect with this group that I want to connect with and feature their voices? And so, again, like sort of an imposition of the pandemic is things going online. And originally, when I was thinking about this project, I had wanted it to be an in person thing, like something where people could come in person and make submissions, and we would feature a big thing in person that people could go to. That obviously didn't happen. But I think with it being online actually opened a lot of doors that wouldn't have been possible had it been in person. And I think that the number one thing is the level of anonymity and kind of confidentiality. That was also really, really important for me with this project. I think having submissions be anonymous removes a big barrier and may allow some people to submit that wouldn't have otherwise. And that obviously wouldn't have been possible if it was in person. So I think like in that way, having it be online, maybe invited more people than in person would have. But like you say, the internet is a privilege. And so I know that it also may have excluded some people. So yeah, it's tough. It's these considerations that we have to make. Yeah, that's a great question.
So I can speak from my professor. Beginning of every week for the readings during the week, he has a video that we watch. And he's going to keep that practice going forward. So that's been a positive of lockdown. He gives a really clear, concise synopsis of the reading that we're going to do, the 2 readings for that week. And that video you can just play over and over and over. Whereas if it was maybe showing up face to face, you may not be able to replay it right away, right? So, you say something. I mean, showing up together is great to stimulate conversation, but when you're researching and understanding material, it's nice to have that video. I don't know, that's the internet for you. That's the plus and the negative. But in a way, lockdown, he said himself, created a positive of him being forced to make a video to really guide the students about what we have to learn.
Yeah, I think we all relate to this because all of us have experienced virtual university. So thank you so much for sharing that with you guys. That was really insightful. I just would like to ask you guys something I'm really curious about, and I believe is very, very valuable. So this is actually something I'm really passionate about and the field I work in. So I'm very curious about your answers. Both of your works touch on the understandings of how women have been disproportionately impacted, the intersectionality of struggles, and the importance of shedding light on the voices of women to reclaim their narratives. So I would like to ask both of you, what is something you've learned from the women you have worked with, and how do you see that changing your work from now on?
Well, I was mentioning, say, people who were living paycheck to paycheck, who used, the frontline retail work really to sustain a household. It was that critical for them, right? I think creating more meaningful work and more opportunities so they don't have to live out of the city. it's a challenging question. We've been talking about housing affordability for over 40 years in Vancouver, but I'm constantly thinking that when I just go out, buying a cup of coffee, where do you work? I'm always thinking in the back of my mind, where do you live? Because the pandemic just exacerbated everything of the inequalities we saw regarding gender, and women were disproportionately affected. So I mentioned in my talk, if a woman was the central caregiver because of the shift, say the husband was a doctor but he's not credited here, that's a huge impact on a household when they were relying, right, on her money to pay for everything. So I don't know, we have to shift our way of thinking.
Thank you so much. Just before we move on to Megan, I just would like to call on the audience to send in any comments, questions that you would like to ask our panelists. So feel free to jot down in the comment box if you have any questions. Yeah, Megan.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been so amazing to be leading this project and to be a part of it, and to just have received all these submissions, especially from survivors. It really has touched my heart, this whole process, and seeing what everybody has to say about their experiences and what healing and justice means to them. And I think what has really stood out to me that I am kind of, I guess, like, is speaking to me and allowing me to continue to do this work is the themes of gentleness and community. I liked that so many of the responses touched on the importance of being gentle with ourselves. And I think that's especially important during the pandemic because of the isolation that we've talked about, but also because I think sometimes we have this pressure to like keep going, keep producing, and like keep always up here. And sometimes we have to just be gentle, especially if you're dealing with trauma. And so I really appreciated that. And also this idea of community and how not only can we work to create the communities that we want to support us, but also how it's okay to rely on your community, or it's okay to ask for help. It's okay to say, this is what I need to be better supported, and for my voice and my experience to be heard. So I think, those are two aspects that really stood out to me from the response we received, and that I'm keeping close to my heart, I guess.
Yeah, I really like that comment, especially because you talk about the importance of building your own sort of social support or your own community that you can rely on, especially when things get so hard. I guess before we close, do either of you all have questions on the other person's work? Because I thought both your presentations were really interesting. But if you all wanted to ask something, otherwise we can have possibly a last question. Yeah.
Megan, so I really appreciate your link. Do you have the link to my website up in the comments? Because
yes,
I can't put anything in the comments. Okay, because I don't.
Yes, I see it there.
Is it? Oh, there, I see it. I see it. Good. So, I'd love to read more about your work, Megan. Are you at the stage of sort of publishing it or anything, or submitting it to a journal, or where are you right now?
Yeah, at this point, it will just live on that webpage sort of indefinitely. I haven't made any plans for anything else really in the future, aside from doing speaking things like this to kind of share the responses. I mean, that's the most important thing to me, is just to share these voices that I have had the privilege of giving the platform to. And I know that, so I mentioned that this project was done for Sexual Assault Awareness Month, which happens every January at SFU and at UBC too. And so I have heard some talks that there may be similar projects being done next year, maybe more so focused on the queer community, asking similar kinds of questions. So I'm looking forward to seeing that hopefully next year. I have a question maybe for everybody. Oh, sorry, and the host maybe. I was just going to ask maybe Cheryl-Lee and even our moderators if you wanted to too. I was just curious, like, in all the work that we're all doing, like, what is it that I guess, kind of like nourishes you, or like what is it about your work that kind of gives you yeah, like nourishes you to keep going, or keep doing this work in these crazy times?
So do you mean personally or academically, or
Both, I would say. I'm always
because
interested in like what keeps people going.
well, I think I've hit on a really good idea. It was put to me by a professor, this whole idea of spatial mismatch. And, it's basically that low income people have longer commute times to work because they live farther away from amenities. I don't know, I'm pretty on fire like that. So I'd love to write a graduate master's research thesis in it. Mind you, I'm also branching into sociology. So I look then at community building. So, what is it about a community that someone has to move outside of where they want to work? So, I'm always looking at my own community here in Kitsilano, and what's the social infrastructure that I see, the critical social infrastructure, and how can it be improved. And for my sociology class, one passionate topic. I just got an A+ in it. I wrote a policy brief for City Hall, and it's to create a community food fridge for the Kitsilano neighborhood house. So that's kind of a passion for me. And I'm looking at immigrant people and how can you connect with a community if you've got limited access to language and things like that. So it's a lot going on for me. How about you, Megan?
Cool, that's really cool. Yeah, I mean, I would just say, like, in this work that I'm doing, it's the responses that I've received from survivors that are really keeping me grounded in like why I'm doing this and why it's important. And yeah.
I think mine is very similar to you, Megan. I work in a very similar field, and I think what keeps me going are the interactions and how, seeing how, changing times show us certain complexities of already existing issues that we didn't see before. And I feel like we can learn so much from it, even though it is so hard, like personally, to keep going sometimes as a community. Once we see like that we can create and use this to our advantage to move from past systems, I think that just keeps me motivated and very hopeful.
Yeah. And for me, Cheryl, I really liked what you said about understanding what makes people leave and just understanding that. So for the past year, as part of our graduate studies, I've been working with the Mongolian diaspora, and a large part of that has just been understanding why do people leave, how difficult is it to actually leave, and what keeps them going. And one thing that we continuously get, like the most common response, is just the communities that they're able to build over here despite the pandemic, despite difficulties. They're able to rely on each other, especially when they're away from family. And that's something that keeps them going and does keep me going as well. So yeah, that was really helpful. Yeah.
Okay, thanks everyone. I know this is really cheesy, but the one thing that comes to mind is, and that has really been coming up for me throughout this entire symposium, is really what keeps me going is connecting with other folks who are doing work like all of us, all the participants in the symposium, because again, I know this is going to sound cheesy, but there's a reason. What the reasons that bring us to do this work are values of social justice, and one of the genesis of this symposium was really thinking about, despite the imposition of quarantine and sort of isolation, quote unquote, we're not isolated, because all, the work that has come out of it, that all of us have shared during this symposium, I'm just thinking about in all these different spaces and all these types of communities and research and whatnot. It is what is keeping us together, is that there are a recognition of the inequalities that have been heightened during the pandemic, that we knew have always existed, but also the possibilities of transformation. So that might be a good segue for us to transition towards our closing remarks. Thank you, Anoushka, Eylul, for moderating, and thank you, Cheryl-Lee and Megan, for your presentations. That was amazing. Um, Yeah, so as we close our 2022 Art Memory and Justice Symposium, I was just really thinking about just the start, the genesis again of the symposium, and thinking about, you know, during when the COVID-19 pandemic happened, and, you know, very quickly everything coming to a halt, all quarantine being imposed in isolation, but then very quickly also, you know, all of the systemic and structural inequalities, or the structural and systemic things that we've all been talking about: capitalism, colonialism, patriarchy, white supremacy, all of it very, very, very quickly figuring it out. You know, as I talk to other artists, you know, we've all not have, you know, this is as burnt out as we've been, despite sort of isolation and quarantine as well. And so I'm thinking about, you know, our first panel, for example, the impossibilities of self-isolation, everyday practices of collective care during pandemic times, with Gabriel and the folks at Long Time No See, and thinking about going back to that, interrogating isolation and quarantine, and thinking about really thinking about the notion of space and taking up public space during a pandemic and quarantine, and also the possibilities that creative practices. I'm thinking about even what we just heard from Cheryl-Lee and Megan in your research, the different practices and possibilities, and creative that. Creative practices, and the possibilities that they offer to challenge these sort of logics of normality, um, that we know that we don't want to return to. I'm also thinking about our second panel, you know, undoing capitalist logics of essential during the pandemic, with Value Co-op and Yarrow Society, and thinking about these grassroots initiatives, and but also how the need for these organizations to respond to deliberate white supremacist and colonial state negligence, and that how. Yeah, and how that those critiques need to continue and have been brought to the surface from the pandemic. And then from our third and fourth panel, so our third panel, decolonizing senses of justice and normality in pandemic times, with Jassy, Tonye, Remy, Andrew, and Shay. So yeah, just obviously interrogating this idea of returning back to normal and thinking about, you know, as we think about moving towards recovery, quote unquote, how might we actually use that as an opportunity to address those systemic issues that continue to create, if not even worsen, the conditions that many marginalized communities face. And then fourth and final, the conversation that we just had, you know, thinking about reflections, praxis, and explorations of community struggles and resilience during pandemic times. Really, I think coming full circle around this idea of thinking about how, you know, these oppressions that we have been thinking about have actually gotten much worse in many cases, and thinking about ways that we can organize and transform, and also thinking about the possibilities of collective organizing in spite of isolation and quarantine. So thank you, everyone, for your what you've offered today. Alejandra?
Yeah, again, thank you, Shirley, Megan, um, sorry, Anoushka and Eylul, for your great moderation. Mm, you have drawn some of the challenge about the, be a student in these pandemic times, and as the comments say, I agree. This is a topic that are very close from our hearts, because this is the role that we are doing now. This is the practice that we are doing, and this is our context to live in COVID. Yeah. So I always wonder about, or I have a big question about how knowledge is produced, how knowledge is created, because with the pandemic, looks like exists an idea that knowledge can be created like in your room with your books and with internet. But sometimes I ask about that, because meetings are very important, you know, encounters, networks, and you have drawn the challenge that we live to continue doing, uh, our studies in these situations, and and maybe that question is something that a lot of us has. And as you say today, as you show today, um, we need some strategies, not just of care, but also of keep that idea that the collective is important. And I want to say thank you because you decide to participate with opponents, you decide to be panelists, and you decide to continue talking, discuss about our topics. You decide to be moderators. You decide to be part of a organizing committee. And I think all that happened in this whole journey and that happened here today, it's a kind of a step to think, believe it, that knowledge is also created in community with others and in conversation and discussion. So thank you so much for that. I want to say thank you to the Transformative Memory Network, UBC Research Excellence Cluster, and Social Justice Institute Memory and Justice Research Stream for their financial support. We also want to thank you, Dr. Pilar Riaño Alcalá and Dr. Erin Baines, who are the principal research of this network, for their support and feedback during this process. We also want to thank the symposium organizing and moderators, Anoushka and Eylul. We want to say thank you to Nila Siautami for all the communication work. And we want to remind you that you can visit the website resilientcartographies.com, where you can find all the gestures that have been contributed for today's symposiums. And we want to remind you also that this link will be in YouTube, and you can revisit this conversation and all the panels that we had today. So thank you so much. I think this is all from me, and
Great.
I hope see you soon in person.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.